This is Worth Kick Legend. Today we're going to talk about stance width. We had a viewer question from Gene Dunn about the correct width of your stance and how to use that to hit and move correctly. First of all, the width of your stance, most abstractly speaking, depends on what you're coming from, what you're doing, and where you're going to. That has a lot to do with how I stand and the width of my footwork. One thing that has always bothered me is how wide boxers can stand and still be very fluid and dynamic. I realized at some point that it's because they wear shoes, right? It sounds like a stupid explanation, but that's basically the explanation. When I have my wrestling or savate shoes on, I can afford to hit much more low and wide and still feel like I can get to the next motion. If you saw my video with Archie Luz where he slipped across and hit that double uppercut, he's very low and moving very well because he has shoes on. I'm sure Archie could do it just fine without shoes, but for the rest of us, I find on the mats it's a little tough to get the impulse needed because you just don't have enough friction between my foot and the mat. I find with shoes I do fewer micro adjustments because there's a lot of friction, so that's inconvenient. But I do get away with more large movements easily because I have more traction to get off the mark with. So that's kind of number one if you're kind of looking about why you can move a certain way in a certain style. Take a look at the terrain and the footwear. That does explain some of it. We used to have a ring at the old gym and the canvas had become very worn. And I noticed that I had to be very centered and high, right? I couldn't make very dynamic steps, right? When I did anything that was really angling off, I felt like I was sliding. And, you know, thankfully we were just playing around with some light contact sparring. I didn't have to plant and really deliver a hard shot. If I had to, it would have been very challenging without shoes on. So pay attention to the terrain you're working on. But that being said, I did find that depending on your movement, you do want to feel like your feet are always under you, right? So if I'm doing a more Thai savate dynamic style, I do tend to have my feet closer together. And if I do a wide stance to take off somewhere, I end up having to push off my rear foot, take a little chip with my lead foot, and get my feet closer together, right? So if I'm doing, let's say, takeoff on the jab or something as I throw my own jab, if I wanted to penetrate deep, it's a little wide, so I'm going to stand up a little bit as I turn into my hook. And you notice sometimes that's a little bump step, so I'm kind of shuffling my feet together and then stepping with my front. If I'm a little more narrow, I can push off with the rear foot and really chip into it, which feels better for power, but that meant that my initial movement had to be smaller, right? I needed a smaller first movement to get away with following up with this. If I wanted a large first movement, I end up not being able to chip into it because I just don't have enough traction and strength in my lead leg from here, so I end up standing up into it. So it's a slightly different feel, but it kind of gets the job done. And again, it is a compromise between what I was doing, what I'm trying to do, and where I want to go next. So that's the short answer, I guess, to that question. You're going to find that you can't follow up with power on the second shot unless you do it from the same stance if your stance is too wide, right? You're going to have to, having delivered a power shot from a wide stance, to move on, you're going to have to strike with less power as you fine-tune your footwork. Or you can kind of make smaller steps and be more mobile, but in turn, you're probably going to be hitting less hard. So I hope that helped. This is a short up explanation. Sometimes I'll work with the heavy bag to get a sense of what that means, right? So I'm out here hitting at what's a pretty long distance for my punching, right? So then if I want to take off that way and angle out, I can hit this one, and I can hit this one if I don't move. But if I want to keep on moving, it becomes a weaker shot. So play around with a partner, play around with the bag to get a sense of what that feels like, the difference between taking committed steps and then using the follow-up step to recover, and using less committed steps but more dynamic, fluid hitting. This is Roy with Kick a Legend here at Michigan Kickboxing Academy. Hope you found this lesson useful. Keep your chin down, elevate your striking. By the way, guys, you may have noticed me wearing my Bruce Lee Doo Doo Talon t-shirt. It's available at my wife's store, PersianCouture.com. She's celebrating this syncretism that the expatriate communities of all over the world have had to embrace, and is part of what makes America and Canada great, in my opinion. So please check it out. You may find it amusing, especially if you have any Middle Eastern friends or Middle Eastern yourself.